The door creaked open, a sound that echoed through the empty halls like a scream. The stale air hit me first, sharp and metallic, with the faint undertone of decay. My flashlight beam trembled against the walls, illuminating streaks of rust and peeling paint. The facility wasn't just abandoned. It had been forgotten, swallowed by time and left to rot in the depths of the forest. I stepped inside, my boots crunching against broken glass and debris. The space was cavernous, stretching into darkness, its ceiling swallowed by shadows. The walls were lined with monitors, their screens cracked and lifeless, cables dangling like severed veins. Something about the stillness felt wrong, too deliberate, as though the place was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the first move. The others followed behind me, their flashlights creating fractured beams that barely penetrated the darkness. Every step felt heavier, the air pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, its thin beam sweeping across the room, catching glimpses of overturned desks, shattered equipment, and what looked like claw marks gouged into the walls. The claw marks weren't random. They were deliberate, carved with a precision that made my skin crawl. They crisscrossed over each other, forming intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The more I stared, the more my stomach churned, like the lines were unraveling something in my mind that I wasn't supposed to see. A low hum vibrated through the air, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from any single source. It was everywhere, a constant undercurrent that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I glanced over my shoulder, but the others didn't seem to notice, or maybe they were just pretending not to. Their faces were pale in the weak light, their eyes darting toward the shadows that crept along the edges of the room. We moved deeper into the facility, the corridors narrowing as we went. The walls seemed to close in, their surfaces slick with condensation. The hum grew louder, sharper, resonating through the ground beneath my feet. My chest tightened, each breath harder to take than the last. The flashlight in my hand flickered, the beam sputtering weakly before steadying again. And then I saw it. The door at the end of the hall was different from the others. It wasn't rusted or broken. It was pristine, smooth and metallic, with no visible handle or hinges. Its surface pulsed faintly, a rhythmic light that matched the hum vibrating through the air. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the light seemed to ripple across the door like water. There was something alive about it, something that didn't belong. One of the others stepped forward, their flashlight beam catching the faint outline of symbols etched into the door's surface. The patterns were sharp and angular, twisting in ways that made my head throb. I reached out instinctively, but the air around the door was colder, sharper, biting into my skin like frost. The hum deepened, resonating through the walls, through my chest, through my skull. The symbols began to move, It wasn't a trick of the light. They shifted, their lines twisting and overlapping, creating new patterns that pulsed in time with the hum. The door trembled faintly, a subtle shudder that rippled through its surface. The air grew heavier, suffocating, each breath cutting into my lungs like shards of glass. The others started murmuring behind me, their voices low and panicked. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door. And then it opened. The sound was deafening, a sharp, metallic screech that echoed through the corridor and vibrated through my chest. The light from the door flared brightly, searing into the darkness, and the hum became a roar, sharp and relentless, vibrating through the walls, through the ground, through my thoughts. The air around the door crackled faintly, sharp and electric, and the temperature plummeted, the frost biting deeper into my skin. Beyond the door was darkness, deeper and more suffocating than anything I'd felt before. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a presence, heavy and malevolent, pressing against my chest, my mind, my soul. Wide, my soul. My flashlight beam disappeared into it, swallowed whole without a trace. The hum was louder now, resonating through the space, and I could feel it burrowing into my thoughts, peeling them back layer by layer. Something moved in the darkness. It wasn't a shadow. It was deeper than that, an absence of form that twisted and coiled at the edges of the light. My chest tightened, my legs trembling beneath me as the air grew heavier, sharper, cutting into my lungs like needles. The thing moved closer, its form fragmented and shifting, its edges flickering like static. My flashlight flickered again, its beam sputtering weakly before going out entirely. And then the whispers began. They were faint at first, curling around the edges of my thoughts, like smoke. Their tones were sharp, dissonant, overlapping in chaotic rhythms that clawed at my mind. I stumbled back, the sound growing louder, sharper, until it was all I could hear. My chest burned, my lungs struggling for air as the thing in the darkness moved closer, its presence pressing against me, heavy and suffocating. The last thing I saw was the light from the door fading, swallowed by the darkness that surged forward, consuming everything in its path. The darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own, heavy and smothering. The air was sharp and metallic, burning as I dragged it into my lungs. I couldn't see anything past the thin glow of my flashlight, which flickered weakly as if the shadows were actively trying to snuff it out. The whispers were louder now, curling through the air in uneven waves, overlapping in chaotic patterns that made my head pound. The corridor twisted and turned in ways that felt unnatural, as though the walls were moving, shifting to trap me deeper inside. Every step echoed faintly, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the silence that clung to everything. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles white, my fingers trembling. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything except the faint hum that had rooted itself into the air and my chest. I wasn't sure if I was alone. The others had been behind me when the door opened, but now there was only the dark and the unshakable sense of being watched. My mind raced, replaying the jagged, flickering shapes I had seen before the light faded. They hadn't been solid, but they had been real, too real. I could feel their presence, lingering, pressing against the edges of my thoughts, like they were still here, just out of sight. The whispers shifted suddenly, their tones sharper, more distinct. Ambiance, so distinct. They weren't just noise. They were deliberate. I could almost make out words, fragments of something ancient and incomprehensible, carried on the low hum that vibrated through the walls and the floor beneath me. I froze, shining the flashlight ahead, the beam trembling as something moved. It was quick, darting just beyond the edge of the light. A flicker of motion, barely there. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stumbled back, my shoulders hitting the cold, damp wall. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw it again. Jagged, angular, shifting like static, but with an intent that made my chest tighten. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against me like a physical weight. I forced myself to move. Each step, slow and deliberate, the ground uneven beneath my feet. The carvings on the walls were brighter here, their sickly green glow pulsing faintly, casting jagged, flickering shadows that twisted and writhed. The symbols were more intricate, more alive, their lines overlapping in patterns that seemed to shift and coil when I wasn't looking. They drew my eyes despite my best efforts, and the longer I stared, the more I felt something unraveling in my mind. The hum deepened, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through my chest. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing against me from every angle. The whispers rose with it, their tones sharper, more insistent, cutting through the air like blades. My head throbbed, each step a battle against the weight that clung to my chest, my thoughts, my very being. The corridor opened suddenly into another room, larger than the one I had entered before. And the walls stretched high into darkness, their surfaces lined with more carvings that pulsed in time with the hum. At the center of the room stood another structure, a tall, jagged pillar of stone, its surface cracked and uneven, glowing faintly with the same sickly green light. The air around it crackled faintly, sharp and electric, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, suffocating. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in chaotic rhythms, clawing at the edges of my thoughts. The hum deepened, sharper now, resonating through the room, and the carvings flared brighter, their twisted lines writhing in chaotic pattern. The pillar trembled faintly, a subtle shudder that rippled through its surface, and the cracks widened, their jagged edges glowing brighter. I stepped closer, my legs trembling beneath me, drawn forward by a force I couldn't explain. The air grew colder, heavier, each breath cutting into my lungs like shards of glass. The whispers became screams, sharp and discordant, slicing into my thoughts, unraveling them one by one. My flashlight flickered again, its beam sputtering weakly, and I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the pillar began to move. It wasn't a physical motion, not exactly. "You?" The light rippled across its surface like water, and the cracks deepened, spreading like veins. The carvings twisted and writhed in response, their lines overlapping in ways that didn't make sense, their light growing brighter, sharper, searing into the darkness. The hum became a roar, sharp and relentless, vibrating through the room, and the ground beneath me shifted violently. Something emerged from the pillar. Its form was fragmented, jagged, its edges shifting and flickering like static. It twisted and coiled, its movements sharp and deliberate, and the void at its center pulsed faintly, brighter, with every passing moment. The air around it crackled faintly, sharp and electric, and the whispers became deafening, their overlapping tones slicing into my mind. My flashlight beam caught its edge, and for a moment I saw it fully, angular, incomprehensible, wrong. I turned and ran. The corridor seemed endless, the walls twisting and narrowing, the carvings pulsing erratically in the flickering light. The whispers followed me, their tones rising and falling in chaotic rhythms, and I could feel the thing behind me, its presence pressing against me, unraveling the edges of my thoughts. The hum deepened, sharper now, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through my chest. The tunnel stretched into darkness, the flickering light from the carvings casting jagged, shifting shadows that danced across the wall. My chest burned, my legs trembling beneath me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The thing was there, just behind me, its fragmented form coiling and twisting, its jagged limbs reaching for me, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. And then everything went still. The stillness wasn't a reprieve. It was a trap. The air, heavy and metallic, pressed into my lungs like a weight I couldn't shake. My chest heaved, my breaths shallow and quick, but each one felt harder than the last. The hum that had followed me was still there, softer now, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it vibrating in my bones, in the marrow of my thoughts. It hadn't stopped. It had sunk deeper. I moved forward, step by step, each footfall hesitant and uncertain. The ground beneath me felt uneven, shifting subtly, as though it too was alive. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely cutting through the oppressive dark. Eldred sword. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their lines twisting and writhing in patterns that defied comprehension. They weren't just carvings anymore. They were alive, watching, waiting. The whispers returned, faint at first, curling around the edges of my thoughts like smoke. They overlapped in chaotic rhythms, rising and falling in a dissonant symphony that made my head pound. I couldn't understand them, not fully, but their intent was clear. They weren't just noise. They were something else, something deliberate. Each tone, each jagged shift in pitch, clawed at the edges of my mind, peeling back layers I hadn't even known were there. The corridor twisted sharply, narrowing as it descended further into the earth. The walls were closer now, their cold, damp surfaces brushing against my shoulders. The carvings grew brighter, their lines more intricate, more alive. I tried not to look at them, but they pulled at my gaze, their jagged patterns searing into my thoughts. Unraveling them, thread by thread, the whispers grew louder, sharper, their tones more insistent, and the hum deepened, resonating through the ground beneath my feet. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath cutting into my lungs like glass. My flashlight flickered again, its beam sputtering weakly, and for a moment I thought I saw something move, a flicker of motion just beyond the edge of the light. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my hand trembling as I swept the beam across the corridor. The shadows shifted, twisting and coiling, but there was nothing there, nothing I could see. I forced myself to keep moving, each step slower than the last. The corridor opened abruptly into another room, larger and darker than the ones before. The walls disappeared into the blackness above, their surfaces lined with more carvings that pulsed faintly, casting jagged, flickering shadows that twisted and writhed. The air here was heavier, colder, suffocating. It pressed against me from every angle, pushing me toward the center of the room, where something waited. The pillar stood tall and jagged, its surface cracked and uneven, glowing faintly with the same sickly green light as the carvings on the walls. The air around it crackled faintly, sharp and electric, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, peeling back the edges of my thoughts. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their tones overlapping in chaotic dissonance, and the hum deepened, sharper now, vibrating through the room. The pillar trembled. It was subtle at first, a faint, almost imperceptible shudder that rippled through its surface. But then the cracks widened, their jagged edges glowing brighter, and the carvings twisted and writhed in response, their lines overlapping in chaotic patterns that pulsed faintly with light. The air grew colder, sharper, cutting into my skin like frost, and the hum became a roar, sharp and relentless, vibrating through the room and into my chest. Something moved in the shadows. Willen of Sir. It wasn't just a flicker of motion this time. It was deliberate, purposeful. The thing emerged from the edges of the light, its fragmented form coiling and twisting, its jagged limbs stretching and retracting in ways that didn't make sense. The void at its center pulsed faintly, brighter with every passing moment, and the carvings flared in response, their sickly glow searing into the darkness. The whispers became screams, sharp and discordant, slicing into my thoughts, unraveling them one by one. The thing twisted and coiled, its movements faster now, more deliberate. The shadows surged forward, their jagged forms coiling and twisting, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. The air crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the thing moved closer, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. The pillar cracked open. The light that burst forth was blinding, searing into the darkness with an intensity that burned into my vision. The thing recoiled violently, its fragmented form twisting and flickering, its jagged edges dissolving into the light. The carvings flared brighter, their lines twisting and writhing in chaotic patterns, and the hum became a deafening roar, vibrating through the room and into my skull. I turned and ran. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, its walls twisting and narrowing, the carvings pulsing erratically in the flickering light. The whispers followed me, their tones rising and falling in chaotic rhythms, and I could feel the thing behind me, its fragmented form coiling and twisting, its jagged limbs reaching for me, pulling at the edges of my thought. The light from the pillar flickered weakly in the distance, a faint glimmer in the oppressive dark, and I pushed toward it with everything I had. The ground beneath me shifted violently, the air growing colder, heavier, each breath cutting into my lungs like needles. My chest tightened as the roar reached a deafening crescendo, and the shadows closed in, their movements sharp and deliberate, their jagged edges coiling around me. And then everything went black. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on all sides, like a living thing. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence, heavy and unrelenting, filling the space with its weight. My breathing was shallow and uneven, each gasp cutting into my lungs, as though the air had turned to knives. The roar was gone now, replaced by an unnatural stillness, but the hum remained, faint and constant, burrowing into my skull like a parasite. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing against the cold, damp wall. The surface was rough beneath my palm, jagged and uneven, and I used it to guide myself forward, step by trembling step. My flashlight had long since failed me, leaving me to navigate by touch and the faint, sickly glow of the carvings that pulsed weakly in the distance. Their light flickered erratically, casting jagged, shifting shadows that twisted and coiled along the walls. The hum grew louder as I moved, resonating through the ground, through the air, through my chest. It wasn't just sound, it was a force, vibrating in the marrow of my bones, unraveling the edges of my thoughts. The whispers had returned, faint and indistinct, curling around the edges of my consciousness like smoke. They overlapped in chaotic rhythms, their tones sharp and dissonant, clawing at the corners of my mind. The tunnel twisted sharply, its walls narrowing until I had to crouch to move forward. The air was colder here, sharper, cutting into my skin like frost. My hands shook as I dragged them along the walls for balance, their surfaces slick with condensation. The whispers grew louder, their tones rising and falling in a dissonant symphony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled into another chamber, larger than the ones before. The air here was heavier, suffocating, and the hum was deafening, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The carvings on the walls were brighter, their lines twisting and writhing in patterns that seemed alive. They drew my eyes despite my best efforts to look away, their jagged patterns burning into my thoughts, unraveling them thread by thread. At the center of the room stood another structure, a tall, jagged obelisk of stone, its surface cracked and uneven, glowing faintly with the same sickly green light as the carvings. The air around it crackled faintly, sharp and electric, and I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, peeling back the edges of my mind. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their tones overlapping in chaotic dissonance, and the hum deepened, sharper now, resonating through the room. The obelisk trembled. The motion was faint at first, a subtle shudder that rippled through its surface. But then the cracks widened, their jagged edges glowing brighter. The carvings on the walls flared in response, their lines twisting and writhing. And the air grew colder, sharper, cutting into my lungs like shards of glass. The hum became a roar, sharp and relentless, vibrating through the room and into my chest. And then it emerged. The thing pulled itself free from the jagged obelisk, its form fragmented and angular, its edges shifting and flickering like static. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen. It twisted and coiled, its movements sharp and unnatural, and the void at its center pulsed faintly, brighter with every passing moment. The air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and the whispers became screams, sharp and discordant, slicing into my thoughts, unraveling them one by one. The shadows at the edges of the room surged forward, their jagged forms coiling and twisting, and I could feel their weight pressing against me, suffocating. My chest tightened as the air grew heavier, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. The carvings flared brighter, their twisted lines writhing in chaotic patterns, and the thing twisted and coiled, its angular limbs stretching and retracting in ways that defied logic. The obelisk began to fracture, its surface splitting apart with a deafening crack. The light that burst forth was blinding, searing into the darkness with an intensity that burned into my vision. The thing recoiled violently, its fragmented form twisting and flickering, its jagged edges dissolving into the light. The carvings flared in response, their sickly glow searing into the darkness. And the hum became a deafening roar, vibrating through the room and into my skull. I turned and ran. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, its walls twisting and narrowing, the carvings pulsing erratically in the flickering light. The whispers followed me, their tones rising and falling in chaotic rhythms, and I could feel the thing behind me, its fragmented form coiling and twisting, its jagged limbs reaching for me, pulling at the edges of my thought. The light from the obelisk flickered weakly in the distance, a faint glimmer in the oppressive dark, and I pushed toward it with everything I had. The ground beneath me shifted violently, the air growing colder, heavier, each breath cutting into my lungs like needles. My chest tightened as the roar reached a deafening crescendo, and the shadows closed in, their movements sharp and deliberate, their jagged edges coiling around me. And then I saw it, another door, just ahead, its surface glowing faintly in the dark. It wasn't like the others. Its light was softer, warmer, cutting through the suffocating black. I didn't know where it led, but it didn't matter. It was my only chance. It's painful. My legs burned as I pushed toward it, the roar and the shadows closing in behind me. The door grew closer, its light growing brighter, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd lost. Hope. The light from the door was unlike anything else I had seen in this place. It didn't pulse erratically or flicker with the jagged unpredictability of the carvings. It was steady, soft, almost inviting, a beacon in the suffocating dark. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't warm. There was no comfort in its glow, only a quiet, alien stillness that sent shivers down my spine. The roar behind me grew louder, vibrating through the tunnel, through the ground, through my chest. The whispers were sharper now, curling around the edges of my thoughts like blades. I stumbled forward, each step harder than the last, the air growing colder, heavier, cutting into my lungs like needles. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam trembling as I swept it across the tunnel, catching glimpses of the shadows that twisted and coiled. Just beyond the light, the door loomed ahead, its surface smooth and metallic, glowing faintly in the dark. The air around it was colder, sharper, biting into my skin like frost. My hand trembled as I reached out, the metal freezing beneath my fingertips. The hum deepened, vibrating through the door, through my chest, through my skull. It wasn't just sound. It was a presence, pressing against me, peeling back the edges of my mind. The door opened without a sound. The light flared brightly, searing into the darkness, and I stepped through, the air shifting abruptly as the door closed behind me. The space beyond was vast, its walls disappearing into the blackness above, their surfaces lined with more of the twisted carvings that pulsed faintly with light. The floor beneath my feet was cold and uneven, its surface cracked and jagged, as though the ground itself had been broken apart and hastily stitched back together. At the center of the room stood another structure, a tall angular monolith that seemed to hum with its own energy. Its surface was fractured, its jagged edges glowing faintly with the same sickly green light that had followed me through the tunnels. The air around it crackled faintly, sharp and electric, and I could feel its weight pressing against me, suffocating. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their overlapping tones becoming screams that claw at the edges of my mind. The shadows moved. They weren't subtle anymore. Their jagged forms coiled and twisted, their movements deliberate and predatory. They pressed closer, just outside the reach of the faint light that emanated from the monolith. I could feel their presence, heavy and suffocating, peeling back the layers of my thoughts. The hum deepened, sharper now, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through my chest. And then I saw it. The thing emerged from the shadows at the edges of the room, its fragmented form coiling and twisting, its angular limbs stretching and retracting in ways that defied logic. The void at its center pulsed faintly, brighter with every passing moment, and the carvings flared in response, their twisted lines writhing in chaotic pattern. The air grew colder, heavier, suffocating, and the whispers became screams, sharp and discordant, slicing into my thoughts. The monolith trembled. Its surface shuddered violently, cracks spreading like veins, and the light that pulsed from within grew brighter, sharper, searing into the darkness. The thing recoiled violently, its fragmented form twisting and flickering, its jagged edges dissolving into the light. The carvings flared brighter, their sickly glow searing into the darkness, and the hum became a deafening roar, vibrating through the room and into my skull. I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the air grew heavier, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. The shadows surged forward, their jagged forms coiling and twisting, and I could feel the thing behind me, its fragmented form closing in, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. The monolith began to crack open. The light that burst forth was blinding, searing into the darkness with an intensity that burned into my vision. The thing twisted and coiled, its movements sharper now, more deliberate. The air crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, clawing at the edges of my mind. The carvings twisted and writhed in response, their lines overlapping in chaotic patterns that pulsed faintly with light. And then the ground gave way. The room trembled violently, the floor beneath me splitting apart, and I fell into the void below. The air rushed past me, sharp and cold, and the light from the monolith disappeared into the darkness above. My chest tightened as the air grew heavier, and the whispers faded into silence, replaced by the faint, steady hum that vibrated through the void. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs, and for a moment I couldn't move. The darkness pressed against me, suffocating, and the hum grew louder, sharper, resonating through the ground, through my chest, through my skull. The air was colder here, heavier, and the carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their lines twisting and writhing in chaotic patterns. The thing was still there. It twisted and coiled at the edges of the light, its fragmented form flickering like static. The void at its center pulsed faintly, brighter with every passing moment, and I could feel its weight pressing against me, peeling back the edges of my thoughts. The air crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and the carvings flared brighter, their sickly glow searing into the darkness. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and stumbled forward, the ground shifting beneath my feet. The light from the carvings flickered faintly, casting jagged, shifting shadows that twisted and coiled along the walls. The whispers returned, faint and indistinct, curling around the edges of my consciousness like smoke. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to move. I had to keep moving. The hum deepened, sharper now, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through my chest. The thing followed, its movements deliberate, its jagged limbs reaching for me, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. The darkness pressed against me, suffocating, and the whispers grew louder, sharper, clawing at the edges of my mind. And then I saw it, a faint glimmer of light in the distance, flickering weakly in the oppressive dark. It wasn't like the light from the monolith. It was softer, warmer, cutting through the suffocating black like a thread of hope. I ran toward it, my legs trembling beneath me, the roar and the shadows closing in behind me. The light grew brighter, filling the space, and for the first time I felt something I hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity, the faint flicker of hope, the faint glimmer of light ahead, pulled me forward like a lifeline. My legs were weak, trembling beneath me, but I pushed on, every step a desperate effort against the oppressive weight of the air. The hum was sharper now, vibrating through my chest, resonating in my skull, and the whispers had returned, their tones rising and falling in jagged rhythms that clawed at the edges of my mind. The ground beneath me was uneven, slick, and shifting, as though it were alive. Each step felt precarious. The faint glow of the carvings on the walls, my only guide. They pulsed erratically, their twisted lines writhing in chaotic patterns, casting jagged, flickering shadows that coiled and twisted along the walls. I tried not to look at them, but their movement pulled at my gaze, their patterns burrowing into my thoughts. The light grew brighter as I moved closer, its glow soft and steady, cutting through the suffocating darkness. But it wasn't comforting. It was cold, sterile, and wrong. There was no warmth in it, only a stillness that set my teeth on edge. I stumbled forward, my breath shallow and ragged, my chest tight with the weight of the air. The hum deepened, vibrating through the ground, through the walls, through my very being. The tunnel opened abruptly into another chamber, larger and darker than any I had seen before. The walls disappeared into the blackness above, their surfaces lined with more of the pulsating carvings that twisted and writhed in response to the hum. The air here was colder, sharper, and the whispers were louder, their tones overlapping in a dissonant symphony that made my head pound. At the center of the room stood a massive structure, a monolith that towered over everything, its surface cracked and jagged, glowing faintly with the same sickly green light as the carvings. The air around it crackled faintly, sharp and electric, and I could feel its weight pressing against me, peeling back the edges of my mind. The hum was louder here, sharper, vibrating through the room, and the whispers became screams, slicing into my thoughts. The monolith trembled. It wasn't a subtle motion. It shuddered violently, the cracks along its surface spreading like veins, their jagged edges glowing brighter. The carvings flared in response, their twisted lines overlapping in patterns that burned into my vision. The air grew colder, heavier, each breath cutting into my lungs like shards of glass. The hum became a roar, sharp and relentless, vibrating through the room and into my chest. And then it emerged. The thing pulled itself free from the monolith, its form fragmented and angular, its edges shifting and flickering like static. It twisted and coiled, its movements sharp and deliberate, and the void at its center pulsed faintly, brighter with every passing moment. The air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and the shadows surged forward, their jagged forms coiling and twisting, pressing closer with every second. The whispers were deafening now, their tones sharp and discordant, overlapping in chaotic rhythms that clawed at the edges of my thoughts. The thing twisted and coiled, its angular limbs reaching for me, pulling at the threads of my mind. My chest tightened as the air grew heavier, suffocating, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. The monolith began to fracture, its surface splitting apart with a deafening crack. The light that burst forth was blinding, searing into the darkness with an intensity that burned into my vision. The thing recoiled violently, its fragmented form breaking apart, its jagged edges dissolving into the light. The carvings flared brighter, their sickly glow searing into the darkness, and the hum became a deafening roar, vibrating through the room and into my skull. The shadows surged forward, their movements faster now, more deliberate, their jagged edges coiling around me. My legs moved on their own, pushing me forward toward the faint glimmer of light that still flickered in the distance. The air crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and the ground beneath me shifted violently, the walls of the chamber twisting and narrowing. The light grew brighter, filling the space, and the whispers faded, replaced by a sharp, piercing silence that was somehow worse. The hum was gone now, and the air grew colder, heavier, each breath a struggle. The carvings on the walls dimmed, their twisted lines frozen in place, their glow extinguished. The shadows receded, their jagged forms dissolving into the darkness. And the thing vanished, its fragmented form disappearing into the void. I stumbled forward, my chest tight, my legs trembling beneath me. The light ahead flickered faintly, casting a soft, steady glow that cut through the darkness. It wasn't warm, but it was there, and it was enough. I pushed toward it, each step slower than the last, the weight of the air pressing against me, suffocating. The light grew closer, brighter, and I reached out, my fingers brushing against its surface. It was cold, sharp, and unyielding, and as the glow enveloped me, I felt the faintest flicker of something I thought I'd lost. Hope, or something like it. The glow enveloped me completely, wrapping around my skin like an electric fog. The light wasn't warm, it was cold, sharp, and unnervingly alive, seeping into my thoughts, filling the cracks where my fear and confusion had lived for so long. It wasn't comforting. It was invasive, a presence that pressed against me with a weight I couldn't push away. The hum returned, subtle at first, like a vibration deep within the core of my chest, and then sharper, resonating in my bones. I took another step forward, my legs trembling beneath me, my breath shallow and uneven. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, fractured, the cracks glowing faintly with the same sickly green light that had followed me through the tunnels. The air here was heavier, colder, suffocating. Each breath was a battle, every movement a struggle against the unseen force pressing down on me. The chamber stretched endlessly ahead, its walls vanishing into a darkness so thick it felt like a physical barrier. The carvings were brighter here, their twisted lines writhing in patterns that seemed to shift and coil when I wasn't looking. They pulsed faintly, casting jagged, flickering shadows that danced across the walls, and the whispers returned, faint and indistinct, curling around the edges of my consciousness like smoke. The light grew brighter as I moved closer, its glow steady and unwavering, cutting through the oppressive dark. It emanated from a structure at the center of the chamber, a monolith unlike any I had seen before. Its surface was smooth and unbroken, its glow soft and steady. But there was something wrong about it, something I couldn't name. It wasn't just an object. It was alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the hum, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through my chest. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of the air pressing against me like a physical force. The whispers grew louder, their tones sharper, more insistent, overlapping in chaotic rhythms that clawed at the edges of my mind. My flashlight flickered weakly in my hand, its beam trembling as it swept across the monolith, catching glimpses of the faint angular patterns etched into its surface. They weren't like the carvings on the walls. They were more deliberate, more precise, and they twisted and shifted in ways that made my head throb. The hum deepened, sharper now, resonating through the chamber, and the air around the monolith crackled faintly, sharp and electric. The glow from its surface grew brighter, sharper, searing into the darkness, and the whispers became screams, slicing into my thoughts with a sharpness that made my vision blur. My chest tightened as the air grew colder, heavier, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. The monolith began to shift. Its surface rippled faintly, the angular patterns etched into it, twisting and writhing, their lines overlapping in chaotic dissonance. The cracks in the ground widened, their jagged edges glowing brighter, and the air grew sharper, biting into my skin like frost. The hum became a roar, vibrating through the room, and the light from the monolith flared brightly, searing into the darkness with an intensity that burned into my vision. And then it broke open. The light that burst forth was blinding, consuming the chamber in a flash so intense that it seemed to erase the darkness entirely. I stumbled back, my arms instinctively rising to shield my face. But the light was everywhere, searing into my thoughts, peeling them back layer by layer. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through my chest, through my skull, and the whispers rose with it, their tones overlapping in chaotic, discordant harmony. The thing emerged from the light. Its form was fragmented, jagged, its angular limbs stretching and retracting in ways that defied reason. It wasn't like the shadows that had haunted me through the tunnels. It was something else, something alive and incomprehensible. The void at its center pulsed faintly, brighter with every passing moment, and the air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric. The whispers became screams, sharp and discordant, slicing into my thoughts, unraveling them one by one. I couldn't move. The weight of its presence pressed against me, suffocating, peeling back the edges of my mind. The carvings on the walls flared brighter, their twisted lines writhing in chaotic patterns, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. The thing twisted and coiled, its fragmented form shifting and flickering, its jagged edges dissolving into the light, and the air grew colder, heavier, suffocating. I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me, and the ground beneath me gave way. I fell into the void, the air rushing past me, sharp and cold, and the light from the monolith disappeared into the darkness above. The whispers faded, replaced by a sharp, piercing silence that was somehow worse, and the hum grew softer, fading into the edges of my thoughts. The darkness pressed against me, suffocating, and the air grew colder, heavier, each breath a struggle. And then I stopped falling. Entirely high. The ground beneath me was uneven, jagged, the cracks glowing faintly with the same sickly green light that had haunted me through the tunnels. The whispers were gone, replaced by an unnatural stillness that pressed against my chest like a weight. The hum was faint now, barely perceptible, but I could still feel it, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through my thoughts. The thing was still there. It twisted and coiled at the edges of the light, its fragmented form flickering like static. The void at its center pulsed faintly, brighter with every passing moment, and I could feel its presence pressing against me, peeling back the edges of my mind. The carvings on the walls twisted and writhed in response, their lines overlapping in patterns that pulsed faintly with light. And then the light returned. It wasn't the cold, sterile glow of the monolith. It was something else, softer, warmer, cutting through the suffocating darkness. It wasn't a reprieve. It was a warning. The thing moved closer, its fragmented form twisting and flickering, and the whispers returned, faint and indistinct, curling around the edges of my consciousness like smoke. And I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The impact was sudden, violent, a metallic shriek of twisting steel, followed by the weightless plunge as the car careened off the road. Branches clawed at the windows like desperate hands, and the thud of the vehicle striking uneven ground reverberated through me. My chest slammed against the seatbelt, and the world blurred into a chaotic swirl of motion and sound before everything came to an abrupt, jarring stop. For a moment, there was only silence. The interior of the car tilted sharply, the windshield shattered into a mosaic of cracks. The faint scent of gasoline hung in the air, mixing with the earthy dampness of the forest. My breaths came shallow, each one searing my chest as I struggled to orient myself. My head throbbed, and when I touched my forehead, my fingers came away warm and sticky. Blood. No. I fumbled for the seatbelt latch, my hands trembling as the latch finally clicked. The sudden release made me slump forward onto the dashboard, where shards of glass bit into my palms. Pushing myself upright, I scanned the mangled cabin. The door on the driver's side was warped, but slightly ajar. With a desperate shove, I forced it open and spilled out onto the forest floor, my legs collapsing beneath me. The world outside was unnaturally still. Obey. I stood unsteadily, clutching the car door for balance. The dense forests surrounded me, its towering trees blocking out what little light remained. Shadows stretched long and dark across the ground, and a faint chill hung in the air, prickling my skin. There was no sound, no rustle of leaves, no chirping birds, just silence, thick and suffocating. I turned toward the embankment, hoping to spot the road, but it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The incline was steep, slick with mud and scattered with jagged rocks, and any sign of a path had disappeared. My phone was shattered, its screen lifeless, and I tossed it aside in frustration. There was no choice but to move forward. The forest seemed to close in as I walked, the towering trees pressing tighter together, their branches interlocked overhead, forming a canopy that plunged the world into twilight. The air grew colder with each step, biting against my exposed skin. My breaths came shallow and ragged, visible in faint puffs before dissipating into the stillness. The first sign of the town appeared as I rounded a bend, a faded wooden sign leaning precariously against a tree, its painted letters barely legible, black hollow. It read. The name sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. Oh, I couldn't say why. The town itself emerged like a shadow from the forest, its weathered buildings blending seamlessly with the twisted trees. The streets were cracked and overgrown with weeds, and an eerie quiet settled over everything. Storefronts stood empty, their windows dark and lifeless, while abandoned cars rusted in the street, their surfaces pockmarked with age. I wandered deeper into the town, my footsteps echoing faintly against the broken pavement. The silence here was different, oppressive, weighted, as though the air itself was holding its breath. My chest tightened, and I fought the irrational urge to call out, to shatter the quiet, but something held me back. Something was wrong here. The faint scent of smoke drifted on the air, mixing with the metallic tang that had followed me from the crash. At the center of town stood a large, decaying structure, a church. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, and its doors hung loosely on rusted hinges. The windows were blackened, and the surrounding ground was scorched, as if it had been the epicenter of some great fire. As I approached, I saw symbols carved into the building's weathered wood. They were intricate, angular, and alien, their lines twisting and overlapping in ways that made my head throb. They seemed to pulse faintly as though alive, and I forced myself to look away, my stomach twisting with unease. The door creaked open as I stepped closer, revealing a dark interior that seemed to swallow the light. The faint smell of ash grew stronger, and a cold draft rushed out, sending a shiver down my spine. The air inside was heavier, thicker, pressing against me with a weight I couldn't explain. I hesitated at the threshold, my breath catching in my throat as I peered into the shadows. The faint sound of whispers drifted from within, soft and disjointed, like voices carried on a distant wind. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone was sharp and unsettling, a low hum that resonated in my chest. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, an unshakable sensation that prickled at the back of my neck. I turned sharply, my flashlight sweeping across the empty street behind me. There was nothing, no movement, no shadows, but the sense of a presence lingered, heavy and unrelenting. I stepped into the church. Well, the air was icy, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The pews were overturned, their wood splintered and charred. The altar was a blackened husk, its surface etched with the same twisting symbols I had seen outside. They pulsed faintly, casting jagged, flickering shadows that danced along the walls. The whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from any one direction. They surrounded me, curling through the air like smoke. Their tones were sharp and discordant, overlapping in chaotic rhythms that made my head spin. My chest tightened and I stumbled back toward the door, my legs trembling beneath me. And then the shadows moved. It was subtle at first, a flicker at the edge of my vision, a ripple in the darkness. But as I stared, they grew bolder, their jagged forms twisting and coiling like living things. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering weakly, and I took a step back, my breath hitching in my throat. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, slicing into my thoughts, and the shadows surged forward, their movements sharp and deliberate. I turned and ran. The cold air burned my lungs as I stumbled back into the street, the oppressive weight of the town pressing against me from all sides. The shadows followed, their jagged edges coiling and twisting, and the whispers chased me, relentless and piercing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Oh, the town swallowed me whole. Each step deeper into Black Hollow felt like I was crossing an invisible boundary, the air around me growing colder, thicker, pressing against my skin like a damp shroud. My breaths were shallow, each inhale laced with the faint tang of decay that clung to the streets. The shadows twisted unnaturally, their jagged forms darting between the empty buildings, moving just outside the reach of my flashlight's trembling beam. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint creak of wooden boards beneath my feet as I climbed the steps of what appeared to be an abandoned general store. Its facade was faded, the once vibrant letters of its sign now flaked and unreadable. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying with an almost deliberate rhythm, as if beckoning me inside. The interior was no less unsettling. Rows of shelves stood empty, their surfaces thick with dust and grime. A single beam of light from a broken window illuminated the space, casting long, warped shadows that stretched toward me like reaching hands. The air was heavy here, too, and with it came the faint, almost imperceptible sound of whispers. I froze, my pulse quickening as I strained to locate the source. The whispers weren't clear. They were fragments of sound, broken syllables that didn't form words, yet they drilled into my mind like splinters. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping around me, closing the space between my thoughts and theirs. At the far end of the store, an old cash register sat crooked on the counter. It was rusted, its keys stuck mid-press, and next to it was an open ledger. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But curiosity clawed at the edge of my fear. Slowly, I approached, each step echoing louder than it should in the empty space. The ledger was blank. No faded ink, no remnants of transactions. Just empty pages, the paper yellowed with age. As I stared, the whispers grew louder, rising from the faint hum of background noise to something more insistent. My eyes darted toward the shadows, the corners of the room where the light didn't reach, but they were empty, or so I thought. The page shifted beneath my hand. I recoiled, my heart hammering in my chest. The ledger's blank surface now bore symbols, jagged, angular markings that seemed to writhe as I stared at them. They were identical to the carvings I had seen on the church, twisting into patterns that defied reason. A sudden creak shattered the silence. I spun toward the sound, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of movement, something small and quick, darting behind one of the shelves. My breath hitched, and I took a step back, my legs trembling beneath me. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper, swallowed by the heavy air. The reply was not a voice. It was the faint rustle of movement, the sound of something shifting closer. The whispers surged again, their tones sharp and dissonant, overlapping in chaotic rhythms that made my head throb. I stumbled toward the door, my flashlight flickering as the shadows twisted and coiled, their movements deliberate, watching. As I stepped back into the street, the stillness returned, heavier now, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, stronger than before, and my chest tightened as I scanned my surroundings. The shadows were still there, lurking at the edges of my vision, but they didn't move. I turned sharply as a figure appeared in the distance, standing in the middle of the street. They were motionless, their silhouette barely visible against the faint light from the gray sky above. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it toward them, the beam cutting through the gloom. The figure's face came into view, pale, gaunt, their eyes sunken and hollow. They didn't move, didn't speak. They simply stared. "Are you okay?" The words felt hollow as they left my lips. The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and unnatural, and the whispers grew louder, curling around my thoughts like smoke. The air grew colder, sharper, cutting into my skin, and I took a step back, the flashlight beam flickering weakly. The gear opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Only the whispers, sharper now, more insistent, vibrating through the air. I turned and ran, the oppressive weight of the whispers pressing against my chest as the figure's silhouette melted into the shadows. The buildings loomed overhead as I stumbled down the street, the air suffocating, the shadows closing in. The town was alive, watching, waiting, and I was trapped. Every street led me back to where I started, the twisted architecture folding in on itself like a labyrinth, and in the distance, the whispers never stopped. The air was thicker now, heavy with the weight of something I couldn't name. My legs moved stiffly, each step feeling like an act of defiance against the unseen force pressing down on me. The whispers hadn't stopped. They ebbed and flowed like a distant tide, faint one moment, deafening the next. They didn't speak words, but carried intent, their dissonant tones burrowing into my thoughts, unraveling them thread by thread. I followed the street deeper into the town, though it was impossible to tell if I was heading in a straight line or moving in circles. The buildings blurred together, their decayed facades blending into the oppressive gray sky above. Windows gaped like hollow eyes, and doorways yawned open, their darkness impenetrable. Every so often, I thought I saw movement, flickers of shadow at the edges of my vision. But when I turned, there was nothing, just the ever-present stillness. Ahead, a shape loomed out of the gloom. It was a house, larger than the others, its silhouette warped and imposing. The walls leaned at unnatural angles, the roof sagging as if crushed under its own weight. Its windows were intact but fogged over, obscuring whatever lay within. A wooden sign hung lopsided from a rusted chain above the porch. I stepped closer, squinting to make out the faded lettering. Black Hollow Inn. The name sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. The whispers seemed to swell as I approached, their tones sharpening, overlapping in a chaotic rhythm that made my head throb. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the gloom as I climbed the creaking steps to the porch. The boards beneath my feet groaned, their sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The door was slightly ajar. Hell. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the tarnished brass handle. The whispers curled around me, faint and insistent, urging me forward. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pushed the door open, the hinges letting out a low, mournful creak. The air inside was colder, sharper, biting into my skin like frost. Dust hung heavy in the dim light, the faint particles catching in the beam of my flashlight. The lobby was eerily preserved, as though its occupants had left in the middle of their lives. A desk stood at the far end, papers and a tarnished bell scattered across its surface. Chairs were arranged in a perfect semicircle near the fireplace, their upholstery worn but intact. But it was the smell that struck me first, damp, metallic, and faintly sweet, like something that had been left to rot for too long. The whispers grew louder, more defined, curling through the air like smoke. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping around the corners of the room and coiling inside my mind. I gripped the flashlight tighter, its trembling beam scanning the space. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, its floral patterns warped and peeling, and the floorboards beneath my feet felt soft, almost spongy. A sound broke the stillness, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from above. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent a spike of dread through my chest. My gaze flicked to the staircase at the far end of the room, its banister worn smooth with age. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like footsteps, echoing through an empty hall, against every instinct screaming at me to leave. I moved toward the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing faintly in the silence. The tapping grew louder as I ascended, accompanied by a faint rustling, like dry leaves scraping against the floor. The whispers followed, their tones rising and falling in chaotic dissonance, drowning out the sound of my own breathing. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, its walls lined with closed doors. The air here was heavier, almost suffocating, and the tapping had stopped. My chest tightened as I swept a flashlight beam down the corridor, the dim light catching on something shiny at the far end. A door stood slightly ajar, its edges splintered and warped. The faint glow of something beyond spilled into the hallway, casting jagged, flickering shadows. The whispers surged again, sharper now, more insistent, and I found myself moving toward the door without realizing it. My footsteps were hesitant, each one a battle against the growing pressure in my chest. 121. The room beyond was small, its walls bare and unadorned. A single chair sat in the center, its back to me, facing a cracked window that overlooked the forest. The glow I'd seen came from the chair itself. Symbols were carved into its surface, angular and jagged, pulsing faintly with a sickly green light. The whispers seemed to emanate from the chair, their dissonant tones vibrating through the room. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath cutting into my lungs like shards of glass. The symbols on the chair writhed as I stared, their lines twisting and overlapping in patterns that made my vision blur. And then, slowly, the chair began to turn. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The chair spun with an unnatural slowness, its movements deliberate, and as it faced me fully, I saw what was sitting in it. Or rather, who? The figure was motionless, its body slumped, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with an empty, glassy stare. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the mouth hung open as if frozen mid-scream. But it wasn't the sight of the figure that rooted me to the spot. It was the fact that it was wearing my clothes. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, slicing into my thoughts with a sharpness that made my knees buckle. The room seemed to tilt, the walls pressing in as the figure's hollow gaze bore into me. And then it spoke, its voice a perfect replica of mine, layered with the whispers that had haunted me since I'd arrived. "You shouldn't have come." The light from the symbols flared violently, filling the room with an unbearable brightness, and the last thing I saw before everything went dark was my own reflection staring back at me, twisted into an expression of pure terror. The darkness swallowed everything, pressing against me like a living entity. My breathing came in short, ragged gasps as I clawed at the void, desperate to find something solid, something real. Slowly, the shadows began to recede, pulling back like a tide, revealing the room once more. The chair was empty now, its surface cracked and scorched, The symbols that had glowed so brightly now faded into obscurity. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling beneath me as the whispers returned, faint and disjointed, curling around the edges of my thought. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the faint smell of burning lingered, sharp and acrid. My flashlight lay on the floor where I had dropped it, the beam flickering weakly. Enga, damug bedunst. I snatched it up, my finger as I swept it across the room. The figure that had been there, Ma, was gone as though it had never existed, but the memory of its empty, glassy eyes was seared into my mind. An image that refused to fade. The whispers grew louder, sharper, overlapping in chaotic dissonance, and I turned toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, its walls pressing inward, warped and uneven. The light from my flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, twisting and coiling like living things. The air grew colder with every step, biting into my skin, and the floor beneath my feet creaked and groaned, as if it might give way at any moment. I needed to get out. Each door I passed seemed to whisper my name, faint and insistent, their tones overlapping in a way that made my head throb. My chest tightened as I resisted the urge to look inside, the knowledge that whatever lay beyond was not meant for me, pressing heavily against my thoughts. The whispers curled around me, growing louder, their tones sharper, more deliberate. At the end of the hallway, a faint light glimmered, pale and cold, cutting through the suffocating darkness. It wasn't like the light from my flashlight. This was something else, something that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. I hesitated, my feet frozen in place, but the air behind me grew heavier, colder, pushing me forward. The whispers swelled, vibrating through the floor, through the walls, through my chest, and I took a step toward the light, then another. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, its surface warped and splintered. As I approached, the light spilled through the crack, casting jagged, shifting shadows that danced across the wall. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open, the wood creaking beneath my touch, and the room beyond was revealed. It was vast, impossibly so, its walls vanishing into the blackness above. The floor was uneven, fractured, its surface jagged and cracked, as though it had been torn apart and hastily stitched back together. At the center of the room stood a monolith, its surface smooth and angular, glowing faintly with the same sickly green light as the symbols I had seen before. The air around it crackled faintly, sharp and electric, and the whispers seemed to emanate from it, their tones rising and falling like a discordant melody. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand, the beam reflecting off the monolith's surface. Its glow grew brighter as I approached, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. The whispers became screams, sharp and relentless, slicing into my thoughts with an intensity that made my vision blur. The monolith trembled. It wasn't a subtle motion. It shuddered violently, the cracks along its surface spreading like veins. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and the air grew heavier, pressing against me with a weight that made it impossible to breathe. I stumbled forward, my legs barely holding me upright, and the light from the monolith flared brightly, searing into the darkness with an intensity that burned into my vision. And then it happened. The light exploded outward, consuming the room in a flash so intense that I had to shield my eyes. The ground beneath me trembled violently, the jagged cracks widening, and the monolith split open with a deafening crack. The air around it shimmered, sharp and electric, and something emerged from within. Its form was fragmented, jagged, its angular edges shifting and flickering like static. It wasn't solid, not in the way I understood. It twisted and coiled, its movements deliberate and unnatural, and the void at its center pulsed faintly, brighter with every passing moment. The whispers became a roar, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through my skull. I fell to my knees, the weight of its presence pressing against me, suffocating. The shadows surged forward, their jagged forms twisting and coiling, and I could feel the things gaze on me, peeling back the edges of my mind. The air grew colder, sharper, cutting into my skin like frost, and the monolith trembled, its surface shuddering violently. The whispers shifted, their chaotic tones becoming deliberate, purposeful. And I realized they weren't random. They were speaking, not in words I could understand, but in rhythms and tones that resonated deep within me. They were inside my thoughts, weaving through them, unraveling them, until nothing felt real. And then the thing spoke. Its voice was a symphony of whispers, layered and overlapping, sharp and discordant. It wasn't a language I knew, but I understood it all the same. It wasn't a message. It was a warning. You were never meant to see. The light flared again, brighter than before, and the last thing I saw before everything went dark was the monolith collapsing inward, its fractured form consumed by the void. The darkness was alive. It clung to me, pulling at my skin, my thoughts, my very sense of self. Every breath I took felt like inhaling cold, heavy water, drowning me from the inside. The whispers had stopped. No, not stopped, shifted. They were deeper now, embedded in the silence itself, a presence so pervasive it pressed against my chest like a second heartbeat. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, as the fractured ground beneath me pulsed faintly with the same sickly green light that had radiated from the monolith. The room, if it could still be called that, stretched on endlessly, its walls dissolving into the void. The air was thick, suffocating, laced with the acrid stench of ozone and something else, something metallic and wrong. The thing was still there. It moved at the edges of my vision, a fragmented angular mass of twisting forms that flickered like static. Its presence was impossible to ignore. A weight that pressed down on me from all sides, peeling back the edges of my thoughts. It didn't come closer, but I could feel it, probing, pulling at the loose threads of my sanity. I turned and ran. The ground shifted beneath my feet, jagged and uneven, each step threatening to send me sprawling into the dark abyss that seemed to yawn beneath the cracks. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the gloom, and the air grew colder, sharper, biting into my skin like shards of glass. The whispers began again, faint at first, curling through the air like smoke, their tones sharp and dissonant. The corridors were endless. Each turn led me to another identical hallway, the walls lined with jagged cracks that pulsed faintly with light. The doors I passed were warped and splintered, their surfaces etched with symbols that twisted and writhed as I stared at them. I knew I shouldn't stop. I couldn't stop. But the symbols pulled at my gaze, their patterns burrowing into my mind like hooks. The whispers grew louder, sharper, their chaotic tones overlapping in ways that made my head throb. The air around me crackled faintly, sharp and electric, and the shadows at the edges of my vision twisted and coiled, their jagged forms moving closer with each step. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle against the suffocating weight of the air. And then I saw it. At the end of the corridor stood another door, its surface smooth and unbroken, glowing faintly with a soft, pale light. It was different from the others, clean, deliberate, untouched by the decay that seemed to have consumed everything else. The whispers surged, their tones rising to a deafening crescendo, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. I didn't want to open it, but I had no choice. The door gave way easily under my touch, swinging inward to reveal a room that was impossibly bright. The light was cold and sterile, searing into my vision, and the air inside was sharper, heavier, pressing against my skin like a physical force. The room was empty, save for a single pedestal at its center, its surface etched with the same writhing symbols I had seen before. Resting atop the pedestal was a box. It was small, unassuming, its surface smooth and polished, reflecting the harsh light like a mirror. The whispers fell silent as I stepped closer, replaced by a sharp, high-pitched hum that vibrated through the room, through my chest, through my very bones. My hand trembled as I reached out, the air around the box shimmering faintly, sharp and electric. The moment I touched it, the world shattered. The light exploded outward, consuming everything in its path, and the hum rose to a deafening roar. The ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling, the air rushing past me, cold and biting, as the void swallowed me whole. The whispers returned, sharper now, more insistent, their tones overlapping in chaotic dissonance, drilling into my mind. And then, just as suddenly, everything went still. I opened my eyes to find myself standing in the forest. The trees towered above me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the air was cold, damp, laced with the faint scent of decay. The town was gone, the monolith, the corridors. Everything had vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence of the woods. But I wasn't alone. The thing was there, watching, waiting, its fragmented form flickering at the edges of my vision. The whispers were faint now, a constant presence at the back of my mind, and the symbols I had seen etched into the walls, the doors, the monolith. They were on my skin, glowing. I took a step forward, my legs trembling beneath me, and the ground beneath me pulsed faintly, sharp and electric. The air grew colder, heavier, each breath a struggle, and the whispers grew louder, their tones rising and falling in chaotic patterns that clawed at the edges of my thoughts. The forest twisted around me, the trees bending and warping, their shadows coiling and twisting, pressing closer with every step. The thing followed, its fragmented form moving just beyond the edge of sight, and the whispers became screams, sharp and discordant, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through my chest. And as I stumbled through the forest, the weight of the box pressed against me like a second heartbeat, its presence a constant reminder that this wasn't over. It had only just begun. The forest pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, its twisted trees seeming to lean closer with every breath I took. The whispers hadn't faded. They had sunk deeper, embedding themselves beneath my thoughts, like roots strangling a foundation. The box in my hands felt heavier with every passing moment, its polished surface glinting faintly in the pale, fractured light that managed to filter through the dense canopy above. My feet moved without direction, driven by a force I couldn't explain. The ground beneath me was uneven, fractured, each step a battle against the biting cold that seeped up from the earth. My breaths came shallow, visible in the icy air, and the taste of iron lingered at the back of my throat. The silence between the whispers grew sharper, more deliberate, like the space was being carved out for something worse. I tripped on a gnarled root, the box slipping from my grasp and landing with a muted thud on the forest floor. The moment it hit the ground, the air around me changed. The cold grew more intense, cutting into my skin like shards of glass, and the whispers surged, rising to a deafening crescendo that made my vision blur. I scrambled to my knees, clutching the box as if it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The forest twisted around me, the trees bent and warped, their branches writhing like serpents, their shadows stretching impossibly long. The ground beneath me cracked and shifted, glowing faintly with the same sickly green light that had haunted me since the town. The air grew thicker, suffocating, pressing against my chest with a weight I couldn't escape. And then the thing appeared. It didn't emerge from the shadows. It was the shadows, a fragmented mass of jagged angular forms that twisted and coiled in ways that defied reason. Its void-like center pulsed faintly, drawing in the light, the air, the very essence of the space around it. It moved without sound, deliberate and predatory, its presence pressing against me like a tidal wave. I couldn't run. I couldn't move. The whispers shifted, their tones overlapping in chaotic dissonance, and I realized they weren't just noise. They were voices, not one but many, layered and distorted, speaking in a language I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. They weren't speaking to me. They were speaking through me. The box grew heavier in my hands, its surface pulsing faintly with the same rhythm as the thing's fragmented form. The symbols etched into it began to writhe, their jagged lines shifting and overlapping, creating patterns that seared into my vision even when I closed my eyes. The whispers became screams, sharp and relentless, drilling into my thoughts, unraveling them one by one. The thing moved closer, its jagged edges slicing through the air with an unnatural fluidity. My chest tightened, my pulse thundered in my ears, and the forest around me seemed to dissolve into the void. The box burned against my palms, its surface searing into my skin, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, overlapping in chaotic, discordant harmony. And then it stopped. The silence was worse. The thing loomed over me, its presence suffocating, its fragmented form twisting and shifting, dissolving into the void and reforming. In an instant, the box in my hands grew impossibly heavy, its surface cracking beneath my grip, and the symbols burned brighter, casting jagged, flickering shadows that danced across the warped forest. A single thought pushed its way through the chaos, sharp and deliberate. Open it. I didn't want to. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to throw the box into the abyss, and never look back. But I couldn't move. My hands, trembling and bloodied, moved of their own accord, the box creaking as its lid began to shift. The air around me crackled sharply, electric and alive, and the thing leaned closer, its void-like center pulsing faintly. The lid opened. The light that poured out was blinding, cold and sharp, cutting through the darkness with an intensity that burned into my vision. The ground beneath me trembled violently, the cracks widening, and the whispers returned, sharper and more chaotic, slicing into my thoughts with a precision that made my head throb. Inside the box was nothing, and everything. It wasn't an object, wasn't a presence. It was a void, infinite and consuming, folding in on itself in a way that made my mind recoil. The thing reacted instantly, its fragmented form twisting and coiling as it was drawn toward the box, its jagged edges dissolving into the void. The whispers screamed in protest, their tones rising and falling in chaotic dissonance, and the forest around me shattered like glass. I fell. The air rushed past me, sharp and cold, as the void consumed everything. The forest, the shadows, the thing, they all dissolved into the light, leaving only the oppressive weight of the box in my hands. The whispers grew faint, then silent, and the void closed in around me, suffocating and infinite. And then I landed. The ground was solid beneath me, uneven and cold, and the air was sharp, biting into my skin like frost. I opened my eyes to find myself back in the forest, the box still clutched in my trembling hands. The symbols were gone, the surface smooth and unbroken, but the weight of it remained, pressing against me like a second heartbeat. The whispers were silent now, but I could feel them, lurking at the edges of my thoughts, waiting. The thing was gone, but its presence lingered, a shadow that pressed against my chest, my mind, my very being. I stood slowly, my legs trembling beneath me, and turned toward the path ahead. The forest stretched endlessly before me, its twisted trees towering overhead, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The silence was heavy, suffocating, but I knew it wouldn't last. It never did. The silence in the forest was not the absence of sound. It was a presence, dense and oppressive, filling the void where noise should have been. It wrapped around me, pressing against my chest, and making every breath feel like an act of rebellion. The box in my hands was still, its weight unnatural, its polished surface unblemished, but vibrating faintly beneath my fingers. I wanted to drop it, to leave it behind and run, but my grip tightened, as though some unseen force bound it to me. I moved forward, though I didn't know why. The forest shifted with each step, the trees bending and warping, their gnarled branches reaching toward me like skeletal hands. The ground was uneven, pulsing faintly with that sickly green light that seemed to follow me no matter where I went. It felt alive, breathing beneath my feet, its rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. The whispers returned, faint and disjointed at first, curling through the air like smoke. They weren't words, not in any language I understood, but their tones carried meaning, intent. They pulled at my thoughts, unraveling them, leaving me exposed and raw. The box pulsed in my hands, each vibration resonating through my chest, my bones, my very being. The path before me widened into a clearing, the ground bare and cracked, the air heavy with the metallic tang of ozone. At the center stood a circle of stones, their surfaces smooth and polished, etched with the same angular symbols that had haunted me since I'd first seen them. The green light emanated from the cracks between the stones, pulsing faintly, casting jagged shadows that danced across the clearing. I stopped at the edge, my feet refusing to move forward. The whispers grew louder, sharper, their chaotic tones overlapping in a way that made my head throb. The box in my hands grew heavier, its surface vibrating more intensely, as if it were alive, reacting to the energy in the clearing. The shadows moved. Far. At first, it was subtle, a flicker at the edge of my vision, a ripple in the air that made my skin crawl. But then they coalesced, twisting and writhing, forming shapes that were jagged and fragmented, shifting and reforming in ways that defied logic. They weren't solid, but they were real, and they were watching me. The box pulled me forward. My legs moved on their own, dragging me into the center of the clearing. The air grew colder, sharper, biting into my skin, and the whispers became a roar, vibrating through the ground, through the stones, through my chest. The shadows pressed closer, their jagged forms coiling around the edges of the circle, their movements deliberate and predatory. As I reached the center, The box began to open. Egen height. I didn't do it. My hands didn't move. But the lid creaked upward, the polished surface splitting to reveal the void within. It wasn't darkness, not exactly. It was absence, a space that consumed everything around it. The light from the cracks in the ground was drawn toward it, bending and twisting as it was swallowed whole. The shadows recoiled, their jagged forms flickering violently, but they didn't retreat. The whispers shifted again, their tones sharp and insistent, and I realized they weren't coming from the shadows. They were coming from the void. The ground beneath me trembled, the cracks widening as the stones around the circle began to glow more brightly. The air was electric, alive, pressing against me from all sides, and the box in my hands grew impossibly heavy. The whispers became screams, sharp and relentless, slicing into my thoughts, unraveling them, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. The shadows surged forward. They didn't move like living things. They moved like a force, a tide of jagged edges and shifting forms that consumed everything in their path. They collided with the void, and for a moment, everything stopped. The air was still, the light frozen, the world held in a suspended moment of unnatural silence. And then it exploded. The void expanded outward, consuming the shadows, the stone, the light, everything. The force of it knocked me backward, my body slamming into the ground as the air was sucked from my lungs. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of overlapping tones that vibrated through my chest, my skull, my very being. The void turned inward, collapsing on itself, taking the clearing with it. The stones crumbled, their symbols glowing faintly before fading into nothingness. The shadows dissolved, their jagged forms disintegrating into the air. The green light flickered once, twice, and then was gone. The box in my hands was silent. I lay there, the cold ground pressing against my back, staring up at the twisted branches above. The silence was absolute, heavy and oppressive, but the weight of the whispers was gone. The box was still, its surface smooth and unblemished, its weight no longer unnatural. It felt empty. But I wasn't. The symbols were still there, etched into my skin, glowing faintly in the dim light of the forest. The presence I had felt since entering Black Hollow was gone, but something else had taken its place. It wasn't the whispers. It was deeper, quieter, a weight that pressed against my thoughts, my chest, my very soul. I stood slowly, the box still clutched in my hands, and turned toward the path. The forest loomed around me, its twisted trees silent and unmoving, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. The air was cold, sharp, and every breath felt like a struggle. I walked forward, my legs trembling beneath me, the silence pressing against me with every step. The box was a part of me now, its presence inescapable, its weight a constant reminder of what I had seen, what I had done. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of my thoughts, the whispers waited. The rain was relentless, turning the narrow forest road into a slick ribbon of black under the beam of my headlights. Hollow Creek wasn't on any map, and the directions I'd scribbled on the back of a receipt had already led me astray twice. But there was no mistaking the tension in the voice on the other end of the call. "You need to come. You're the only one who'll listen." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel as the trees closed in on either side, their branches clawing at the edges of the windshield. My breath fogged the glass, and I cracked the window slightly, letting in the damp, metallic chill of the air. The house came into view suddenly, its silhouette stark against the faint gray glow of the storm. The porch light flickered weakly, barely holding back the oppressive darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. I parked on the gravel driveway, the crunch of the tires swallowed by the rain. As I stepped out, my shoes sank into the mud, the cold seeping through the thin soles. The house loomed over me, its windows dark and empty, watching. There was no sign of movement, no sound but the rain and the faint creak of the trees swaying in the wind. The door opened before I could knock, and Mrs. Riggs stood there, her face pale and drawn, her hands clutching the edges of a blanket draped over her shoulders. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression haunted, as if she hadn't slept in days. She didn't speak, just stepped aside to let me in, her movements mechanical. The inside of the house was stifling, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly acrid. Family photos lined the walls, their smiling faces, a stark contrast to the heavy silence that filled the space. A single lamp cast a dim glow over the living room, its light barely reaching the corners of the room, where shadows pooled like dark water. She led me to the kitchen, where her husband sat at the table, his head bowed, his hands clenched into fists. A single piece of paper lay in front of him, the edges crumpled, the ink smudged. As I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a drawing, crude, childlike, but unmistakable. A dark figure with glowing eyes, surrounded by jagged lines that radiated outward like cracks in glass. This was the last thing Jamie drew before he disappeared, Mrs. Riggs said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands trembled as she pushed the drawing toward me, her gaze fixed on the floor. Hay said it was in the woods, that it was watching him. A chill ran down my spine, and I resisted the urge to glance toward the window. "When did you last see him?" Her husband spoke this time, his voice rough and unsteady. "3 nights ago. He was playing in the yard right before sunset. We heard him scream, but by the time we got outside, he was gone. Just gone." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I looked down at the drawing again, my stomach tightening. The figure in the picture wasn't just a shadow. It had form, angular and fragmented, its eyes staring back at me from the page with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I went into the woods to look for him, Mr. Riggs continued, his voice cracking. I called his name over and over, but all I heard was... He trailed off, his hands trembling. Enduft, Gavild, tremble. It was his voice, calling back. But it wasn't him. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on us like a physical force. I glanced toward the window. The rain streaking down the glass, blurring the dark shapes of the trees beyond. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, its shadows shifting and coiling in the faint light. I asked for a flashlight and ventured outside, the cold biting into my skin as the rain soaked through my jacket. The ground was slick with mud, and the beam of the flashlight barely cut through the dense darkness. The trees towered above me, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that blocked out the faint glow of the moon. The air grew colder as I followed the faint path leading into the woods, my footsteps muffled by the wet ground. The sound of the rain faded, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears. My breath came shallow and quick, each exhale visible in the cold air. And then I heard it, faint voice carried on the wind, just barely audible. It was a child's voice, calling out, trembling with fear. Help me, please. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, the beam slicing through the darkness. The voice came again, closer this time, but distorted, like it was coming from underwater. Over here. Howl. Hayworth, Helimomi. I moved toward the sound, my steps quickening, despite the unease gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The voice led me deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground grew uneven, the mud sucking at my shoes, but I pressed on, the faint glimmer of hope outweighing the dread that clung to me. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment I was plunged into darkness. I froze, my breath hitching as the silence enveloped me. When the beam sputtered back to life, I saw it. A dark figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, its angular form shifting and flickering like static. Its eyes glowed faintly, piercing through the shadows. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. Help me. The voice froze me in place. It wasn't a scream or a shout. It was quiet, almost gentle, but that made it worse. It was wrong, like hearing a song played backward. I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand, the beam cutting through the dark like a blade. There was nothing there, only the trees, their jagged forms looming over me, and the endless black of the forest. My heart thundered in my chest. As I scanned the area, my breaths coming in shallow gasps, the voice echoed again, softer now, curling around me like smoke. Help me, please. It was unmistakably a child's voice, trembling and fragile, but it carried something else, something hollow and artificial, like a recording played through broken speakers. I took a step forward, the ground slick and unsteady beneath my feet. The air was colder, now sharper, biting into my skin as the darkness seemed to press closer. The flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering weakly as if struggling to pierce the suffocating black. I moved cautiously, the mud sucking at my boots with each step, and the voice came again, closer this time. "Don't leave me." My legs felt like lead, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave the woods and never return. But I couldn't. The voice was pulling me, guiding me deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around me, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the faintest hint of moonlight. The only sound was the squelch of my boots in the mud and the faint rhythmic pulse of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The flashlight beam swept across a break in the trees, and my breath caught in my throat. A small clearing lay ahead, bathed in an unnatural light that didn't seem to come from any source. The air here was heavy, oppressive, filled with a faint hum that vibrated through my chest. At the center of the clearing stood a small wooden structure, its walls warped and weathered, leaning as though it might collapse at any moment. The voice was coming from inside. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath forming clouds of mist that hung in the air before dissipating into the dark. The structure seemed to beckon me, its crooked door slightly ajar, revealing nothing but inky blackness beyond. The hum grew louder, a low, steady vibration that settled deep in my bones. I stepped into the clearing, the ground beneath me crunching faintly despite the mud. The unnatural light didn't flicker or waver. It simply was, blanketing the area in a cold, sterile glow that made the shadows seem darker by contrast. My flashlight was useless here, its beam swallowed by the light, and I lowered it slowly, my fingers gripping it like a lifeline. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound sharp and jarring against the silence. Inside, the air was colder still, so cold it burned my lungs with every breath. The walls were covered in crude drawings, scrawled in what looked like charcoal or ash. They depicted jagged shapes, distorted figures with angular limbs and hollow eyes, their forms twisted and fragmented. Symbols lined the edges of the drawings, patterns that made my head ache just to look at them. In the center of the room was a single chair, its back to me, facing a broken window that overlooked the endless forest. The chair wasn't empty. A figure sat slumped in it, small and motionless, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped closer, the wooden floor creaking beneath me. "Jamie," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Engli, Kudali. Came to you," and the figure didn't move. The air grew heavier, pressing against me like a weight, and the hum became a low, insistent thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers brushing against the cold wood of the chair, and the figure moved. Its head snapped upright, its hollow eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. The figure wasn't Jamie. It wasn't anyone. Its face was smooth, featureless, its skin pale and translucent, its form flickering like a dying signal. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't from outside. It was in my head, sharp and clear, cutting through my thoughts like a knife. You shouldn't have come. The light in the clearing flared suddenly, blinding and cold, and the figure dissolved into static, its form breaking apart into jagged lines that flickered and disappeared. The hum became a roar, filling the room with a deafening cacophony that made my head throb. The walls seemed to pulse, the drawings shifting and writhing, the symbols glowing faintly with that same sickly green light. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and the door slammed shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the room. The air grew heavier, suffocating, and the voice whispered again, softer this time, curling around my thoughts like smoke. Run tabania. Ti, Tuvil. I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted, my feet slipping on the uneven floor as I shoved the door open and burst into the clearing. The unnatural light was gone, replaced by the oppressive black of the forest, and the hum had faded into silence. My flashlight flickered weakly in my hand as I stumbled back toward the path, the trees looming over me like sentinels. The voice followed me, faint and insistent, echoing through the dark. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a plea. It was laughter. The forest didn't feel the same as it had before. It was alive in ways that defied sense, pulsing and shifting with each step I took. The darkness clung to me like a second skin, wrapping around my thoughts, my breath, my every movement. The laughter that had chased me from the clearing was gone now, but the air still carried its weight, as though the echoes of it had seeped into the trees themselves. I didn't know where I was going. The path had long since disappeared, swallowed by the ever-twisting landscape, and every direction looked the same. The flashlight flickered in my hand, its weak beam cutting jaggedly through the shadows, barely illuminating the ground in front of me. My feet slipped on the uneven terrain, the mud thick and sticky, pulling at my boots with every step. A sound broke the silence, faint but deliberate, a rustling just beyond the edge of the light. My pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I swung the flashlight in the direction of the noise. The beam landed on a tree, its bark warped and gnarled, and just beyond it, I caught the faintest glimpse of movement. A shadow shifted, quick and fluid, vanishing into the black. Before I could fully register it, I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The forest was utterly still again. The only sound, the faint rustle of leaves above me, but I could feel it. The weight of something watching, waiting, just out of sight. The flashlight trembled in my grip as I forced myself to keep moving, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder as I pressed on, sharp and biting, burning my lungs with every shallow breath. The trees loomed closer now, their branches interlocking overhead, forming a canopy so dense that even the faint glow of the moon was entirely blotted out. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, the roots of the trees twisting and coiling like the limbs of some ancient beast. And then I saw it. A structure emerged from the shadows ahead, its silhouette jagged and irregular, like it had been built from pieces of the forest itself. The walls were made of weathered wood, patched together with strips of metal and wire, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. A single window stared out at me, its glass cracked and filthy, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. I didn't want to go inside. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back, to run as far and as fast as I could, but my feet moved on their own, drawn forward by a force I couldn't explain. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight, and the whispers began again, curling around the edges of my thoughts like tendrils of smoke. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence. The interior was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single lantern hanging from the ceiling, its flame flickering weakly. The room was cluttered, filled with furniture and objects that looked like they had been scavenged from a dozen different places. Shelves lined the walls, stacked haphazardly with jars of unidentifiable contents, and the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. In the center of the room stood a table, its surface covered in papers, books and maps, all yellowed with age. Symbols were scrawled across them, jagged and angular, their patterns chaotic and disjointed. They matched the drawings I'd seen in the clearing, the same twisted shapes and hollow eyes staring back at me from the pages. A noise behind me made me spin around, the flashlight beam slicing through the dark. There was nothing there, just the open doorway, the forest beyond shrouded in black. But the air had changed, the temperature dropping sharply, and the whispers grew louder, their tones overlapping in chaotic dissonance. I turned back to the table, my hands trembling as I reached for one of the papers. The symbols on it seemed to shift and writhe beneath my gaze, their lines twisting and coiling like living things. My vision blurred, a sharp pain lancing through my head as the whispers drilled into my thoughts, louder and sharper with every passing second. And then a voice, not a whisper this time, but a clear, deliberate voice, low and distorted, vibrating through the air. You see now? The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor as the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around me. The lantern flickered violently, its light casting jagged, shifting shadows that danced across the room. The papers on the table fluttered, the symbols on them glowing faintly with that same sickly green light that had haunted me since the beginning. The voice came again, closer this time, filling the room with its weight. You shouldn't be here. The shadows coalesced, twisting and writhing, forming shapes that were jagged and fragmented, their edges sharp and angular. They moved toward me, slow and deliberate, their forms flickering like static. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled back, my legs refusing to move fast enough. The lantern's flame flared, bright and blinding, and the shadows dissolved into the light. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of something unseen. The papers on the table were still now, the symbols faded and lifeless, and the whispers were gone. But the voice wasn't. It lingered, soft and insistent, curling around the edges of my thoughts like smoke. And as I stumbled back out into the forest, the words followed me, faint but undeniable. Run while you still can. The cold had changed. It wasn't just in the air anymore. It was inside me, curling around my ribs, seeping into my thoughts. Every step I took away from the house felt heavier, as if the forest itself were trying to pull me back. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam struggling to cut through the thick, oppressive dark that swallowed everything beyond a few feet. The trees were silent, but the whispers had returned, softer now, more insidious. They wrapped around my mind, their tones sharp and disjointed, overlapping in chaotic layers that made my vision blur. I tried to focus, to keep moving forward, but the ground beneath my feet was uneven, the roots of the trees twisting and coiling like they were alive. The path I'd come in on was gone. I didn't know how long I'd been walking. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together in the blackness. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in shallow, visible puffs in the freezing air. The forest pressed closer, the branches above intertwining so tightly that no light from the moon or stars could filter through. And then I saw it, a faint glow ahead, pulsing softly like a dying ember. I moved toward it, my legs feeling like lead with every step. The light grew brighter as I approached, illuminating the jagged trunks of the trees, the gnarled roots snaking across the ground. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, their overlapping tones forming a discordant melody that vibrated through my chest. The source of the light came into view, a circle of stones, their surfaces etched with angular symbols that glowed faintly with that same sickly green light. The ground inside the circle was bare, the mud and roots giving way to smooth, polished stone that shimmered like glass. The air was different here, heavier, almost electric, and the whispers seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The symbols on the stones pulsed faintly, their glow growing brighter with each step I took. The whispers swirled around me, sharp and insistent, and the air grew colder, biting into my skin like shards of ice. At the center of the circle was something I couldn't quite make sense of. A jagged, angular object that seemed to shift and flicker like static. It wasn't solid, not entirely. Its edges blurred and reformed, its surface rippling like water. The green light emanated from within it, casting jagged, shifting shadows across the clearing. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and I stumbled backward, my vision swimming. The symbols on the stones flared brightly, their light searing into the darkness, and the object at the center began to change. It twisted and coiled, its fragmented form pulling inward, folding in on itself like it was collapsing into the void. The forest around me seemed to shift, the trees bending and warping, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground beneath me trembled, the cracks in the earth glowing faintly with that same green light. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey, rooted to the spot as the air grew heavier, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. And then it spoke. The voice was low and distorted, vibrating through the air like the hum of an engine. It wasn't loud, but it filled the clearing, resonating in my chest, my thoughts, my very bones. You don't belong here. The words weren't in English. Not exactly, but I understood them all the same. They were inside my head, twisting through my thoughts like vines, suffocating and inescapable. The object at the center of the circle shifted again, its form becoming sharper, more defined. It was tall now, angular, its edges jagged and irregular, its surface shimmering with that same sickly light. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were screams, sharp and discordant, slicing into my mind with an intensity that made my head throb. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling, as I tried to raise the flashlight. The beam flickered weakly, cutting through the dark, just enough to reveal the jagged shadows that moved at the edge of the clearing. They weren't trees. They weren't human. The voice came again, louder this time. Its tones sharp and insistent. You can't stop it. The shadows surged forward, their jagged forms coiling and twisting, moving with a deliberate, predatory grace. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me shifted, the cracks widening, glowing with a light so bright it burned into my vision. The air grew colder still, each breath a struggle, and the screams became a roar, vibrating through the forest, the stones, my chest. I fell, the ground slick and uneven beneath me, and the flashlight slipped from my grasp, its beam cutting a jagged line through the blackness. The shadows were closer now, their forms shifting and flickering, their movements erratic and unnatural. The object at the center of the circle flared brightly, its light exploding outward, consuming everything in its path. The shadows dissolved into static, their forms breaking apart and vanishing into the void. The ground trembled violently, the cracks splitting wider, and the air was filled with a deafening hum that drowned out even the whispers. And then everything stopped. The light vanished, the forest falling into an oppressive silence. The stones were still now, their glow faded, their symbols lifeless. The object at the center was gone, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air where it had been. I lay there, the cold ground pressing against my back, staring up at the twisted branches above. The whispers were gone, but the weight of them lingered, pressing against the edges of my thoughts. The forest was silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like it was waiting. The forest was quiet now, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy, pressing against me like a living thing, smothering every sound and thought. My breath was the only noise, shallow and uneven, breaking in sharp gasps against the freezing air. The green light that had pulsed from the stones was gone, leaving only the suffocating darkness and the faint shimmer where the object had vanished. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. My flashlight was gone, swallowed by the cracks in the ground, its weak beam extinguished forever. The dark was absolute, a void so complete that I couldn't see my hands in front of me. But I felt it, something beyond the black, a presence that coiled and shifted at the edges of perception. The whispers hadn't returned, but their absence felt wrong. My thoughts were too loud, echoing in the emptiness, like they didn't belong to me anymore. The forest was waiting, its weight pressing down with every breath I took, urging me to move, to leave. But I didn't know where to go. The path had dissolved into the chaos, leaving only the jagged terrain and the faint sense of being watched. I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched, groping blindly through the dark. The air was colder now, biting into my skin, and the ground beneath me was uneven, fractured, and slick with mud. Each step felt like a gamble, the earth threatening to give way beneath me at any moment. But I couldn't stop. I didn't dare. A noise broke the silence, a faint rustling, distant but deliberate. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and turned toward the sound. It came again, closer this time, sharp and quick, like something moving through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see through the darkness. But there was nothing there, only the void. And then the whispers returned. They were faint at first, curling through the air like smoke, but they grew louder, sharper, filling the space around me with their chaotic tones. They weren't just noise. They were voices, layered and distorted, speaking in a language that I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my bones. They overlapped, crashing into each other in dissonant waves, drilling into my thoughts with an intensity that made my head throb. The ground beneath me trembled, the cracks glowing faintly with that same sickly green light. It pulsed rhythmically, in time with the whispers, and the air grew heavier, sharper, each breath a struggle. I stumbled forward, my hands brushing against the rough bark of a tree, and the light flared brighter, casting jagged shadows that danced across the forest. The whispers surged, rising to a deafening crescendo, and the shadows moved. They twisted and coiled, jagged and fragmented, their forms flickering like static at the edge of my vision. They weren't solid, not entirely, but they were real enough to make my skin crawl. I backed away, my chest tightening as the shadows pressed closer, their movements deliberate and predatory. A voice cut through the chaos, low and distorted, vibrating through the air like the hum of an engine. You shouldn't be here. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, deliberate, resonating in my chest, my bones, my very thoughts. The shadows surged forward, their jagged forms coiling around me, and the ground beneath my feet gave way. I fell, the earth swallowing me whole, and the light vanished, replaced by the suffocating black. When I hit the ground, the air was cold and damp, filled with the faint scent of decay. The whispers were gone again, but the silence was worse. It pressed against me, heavy and smothering, and the dark felt alive, shifting and coiling at the edges of my vision. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, and looked around. I was in a tunnel. I was in a tunnel. The walls were rough and uneven, carved from the earth itself, and the air was thick, suffocating. Symbols lined the walls, etched into the stone with a precision that felt unnatural, their jagged lines glowing faintly with that same sickly light. The whispers returned, faint and insistent, curling through the air like smoke, and the ground beneath me pulsed in time with their rhythm. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, its darkness impenetrable, and the air grew colder with each step I took. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift and writhe as I moved, their patterns twisting into shapes that made my head throb. The whispers grew louder, their chaotic tones overlapping in a way that made my thoughts feel fractured, disjointed. And then I saw it. The end of the tunnel opened into a cavern, its walls jagged and irregular, lined with the same glowing symbols that had haunted me since the beginning. At the center of the cavern was a pedestal, its surface smooth and polished, and resting on it was the object. It wasn't the same as before. Silverness. It had changed, its form sharper, more defined, its jagged edges glowing with a light that pulsed rhythmically, in time with the whispers. The air around it was sharp and electric, crackling faintly, and the ground trembled beneath my feet. The voice returned, louder this time, its tone sharp and insistent. You can't stop it. The whispers surged, their tones rising to a deafening roar, and the light from the object flared, blinding and cold. The cavern trembled violently, the walls cracking and shifting, and the air grew heavier, suffocating, pressing against me from all sides, and then everything went still. The stillness was worse than the chaos. The silence pressed against me, suffocating and absolute, as though the cavern itself was holding its breath. My chest tightened, and my pulse roared in my ears, the only sound in the oppressive void. The object on the pedestal glowed faintly now, its jagged edges pulsing with a weak, sickly light that cast jagged shadows across the uneven walls. I took a step closer, my boots scraping against the uneven stone floor, the sound jarring in the otherwise perfect quiet. The air felt heavier with each step, pressing against my chest, my limbs, as though the cavern itself was resisting my movements. My hands trembled at my sides, the weight of the unseen presence around me gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The object seemed alive, its surface shifting and rippling like water. Though it remained solid, the symbols carved into the pedestal glowed faintly, their jagged lines pulsing in time with the object's light. I could feel the whispers just beneath the surface of my thoughts. Now, faint, but insistent, like a dull ache pressing against the back of my skull. The pedestal wasn't large, but it loomed over me as I approached, the glow from the object casting a cold, pale light that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. My fingers itched to reach out, to touch it, though I didn't know why. It wasn't curiosity. It was something deeper, something I couldn't name, pulling at me like a tide. The whispers grew louder as I stepped closer, their tones sharp and chaotic, overlapping in a dissonant symphony that vibrated through my chest. The ground beneath me trembled faintly, the cracks in the stone glowing faintly with the same sickly light. The cavern felt alive, shifting and coiling around me, its presence pressing against my thoughts like a weight. I reached out, my hand trembling, and the whispers surged, sharp and insistent, drilling into my mind. My fingers brushed against the object's surface, and the light flared, blinding and cold, searing into my vision with an intensity that made me recoil. The cavern trembled violently, the air filled with a deafening hum that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. The object shifted beneath my touch, its jagged edges twisting and coiling, its form breaking apart and reforming in an instant. The whispers became a roar, sharp and relentless, slicing into my thoughts with a precision that made my head throb. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, and the object's light pulsed brighter, its glow consuming the cavern. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath burning my lungs as the cavern seemed to collapse. Inward, the walls bending and warping like liquid. The ground beneath me cracked and shifted, glowing with a light so bright it burned into my vision, and the whispers screamed, their chaotic tones rising to a deafening crescendo. And then the voice came again. You were never meant to see this. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, deliberate, vibrating through the air like the hum of a machine. The cavern trembled violently, the cracks widening beneath my feet, and the light from the object flared brighter, consuming everything in its path. The ground gave way, and I fell, the air rushing past me, cold and sharp, as the void swallowed me whole. When I hit the ground, the air was thick and suffocating, filled with the faint scent of decay. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest, my lungs, making every breath a struggle. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, and looked around. I wasn't in the cavern anymore. The space around me was vast and empty, its walls jagged and irregular, glowing faintly with the same sickly light that had haunted me since the beginning. Symbols lined the walls, their jagged lines pulsing faintly, and the air was sharp, electric, vibrating faintly with a hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The object was here, suspended in the air above me, its jagged edges glowing brightly, its surface rippling like water. The whispers returned, faint and insistent, curling through the air like smoke, and the light from the object pulsed in time with their rhythm. The voice returned, louder this time, its tone sharp and insistent. You cannot stop it. The whispers surged, their tones rising to a deafening roar, and the light from the object flared, blinding and cold. The ground beneath me trembled violently, the cracks splitting wider, and the air grew heavier, suffocating, pressing against me from all sides. And then everything went still. The stillness wasn't relief, it was suffocating, as though the very air had been drained from the space. The light from the object had dimmed now, its glow pulsing faintly like the last breaths of a dying star. The walls around me no longer shimmered, but seemed to bend inward, trapping me in a space that felt both infinite and claustrophobic. I struggled to stand, my body trembling from the weight of everything that had come before. My thoughts were fragments, scattered like broken glass, each one cutting into the edges of my consciousness. The whispers were gone, but their absence was a wound, raw and aching, as though the silence itself was a scream. The object hovered above me, its jagged edges twisting and coiling in ways that defied logic. It was smaller now, more contained, but no less alive. Its surface rippled like liquid, the faint green light reflecting off the uneven walls. I wanted to move away from it, to put distance between myself and the thing that had torn this hole in the world. But my body wouldn't obey. My feet were rooted to the ground, the weight of the air pressing me down, holding me in place. The voice came again, low and deliberate, vibrating through the space like the hum of a distant engine. You are the key. I didn't want to understand, but the words burrowed into my mind, sharp and inescapable. Images flooded my thoughts, jagged and disjointed, fragments of things I had never seen but somehow knew. A circle of stones, glowing faintly in the dark. A hand reaching out, trembling as it brushed against the object's jagged surface. And then the collapse, the world breaking apart, folding in on itself, consumed by the void. The images faded, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest. The object pulsed brighter, its light casting jagged shadows across the warped walls, and the air grew heavier, sharper, each breath a struggle. The voice returned, its tone sharp and insistent, cutting through the silence like a blade. You must choose. The words reverberated through the space, each syllable a weight pressing against my chest, my thoughts. I didn't know what the choice was. There was no clarity, no explanation. Only the object, its light pulsing in time with the faint rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floor beneath me. I reached out without meaning to, my hand trembling as it moved toward the object's shifting surface. The air grew colder, biting into my skin, and the walls seemed to close in, their jagged edges pressing against the edges of my vision. My fingers brushed against the object, and the light flared, blinding and cold, searing into my thoughts with an intensity that made me gasp. The world shifted, the walls dissolved into static, their jagged lines breaking apart and reforming in an instant. The ground beneath me trembled, the cracks glowing with a light so bright it burned into my vision. The air was alive now, sharp and electric, vibrating through my chest, my skull, my very being. The object pulsed brighter, its form expanding, twisting into something vast and incomprehensible. The voice returned, louder now, filling the space with its weight. "You can end it." The light from the object flared again, consuming everything in its path, and the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, the air rushing past me, cold and sharp, as the void swallowed me whole. When I hit the ground, the air was thick and suffocating, filled with the faint scent of decay. The whispers were back now, faint and insistent, curling around the edges of my thoughts like tendrils of smoke. The object was gone, its light extinguished, leaving only the suffocating darkness and the weight of everything that had come before. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, and looked around. I wasn't in the cavern anymore. The space around me was vast and empty, its walls jagged and irregular, glowing faintly with the same sickly light that had haunted me since the beginning. Symbols lined the walls, their jagged lines pulsing faintly, and the air was sharp, electric, vibrating faintly with a hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a void so complete it seemed to press against my chest, my thoughts. The object was gone, but its presence lingered, a weight that settled deep in my chest, in my bones, in the space between breaths. I turned toward the only direction that seemed to lead somewhere, a faint glimmer of light in the distance, and began to walk. The ground beneath me was uneven, the cracks glowing faintly with that same sickly light, and the air grew colder with each step. The whispers didn't return, but the weight of them lingered, pressing against the edges of my thoughts, my chest, my very being. The light ahead grew brighter, sharper, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls, and the air grew heavier, suffocating with each step. When I reached the light, I realized it wasn't a way out. It was a doorway, an archway carved from the stone itself, its edges lined with the same jagged symbols that had haunted me since the beginning. The light pulsed faintly, its rhythm matching the pounding of my heart, and the air grew colder, sharper, as I stepped through. Beyond the doorway was nothing, an endless void of black, stretching out in every direction. The ground beneath me was gone, but I didn't fall. I floated, weightless, as the whispers returned, faint and insistent, curling around the edges of my thoughts like smoke. And then the voice returned, louder than ever, its words final. "It begins, but bendis, beginnors." The light flared, and the void consumed everything,